about this book, The Greater Generation. Just talking about this book to people informally brings up everybody gets all, wow, those guys, those already had a few little arguments already. But anyway, the premise of the book is that it's the baby boomers who are the greatest generation, not the generation that's called the greatest generation. So here to review it is Karen Mahar. She teaches over at Siena. She teaches in the history department. And she's also the director of the American Studies program. And this book is right up her alley, she said. So she's going to talk about this book, The Greater Generation, in defense of the baby boomers. But how many people here are actually baby boomers besides?
We are. We're baby boomers.
So it looks like
we're the greater.
The rest of you will have to defend yourselves.
Parents are the baby
So here's Karen Mahar.
Parents are baby boomers.
Thank you, Joe. Well, thank you for inviting me to come here today. It's fun for me to talk about a topic like this because it is a lively one, to be sure. When Leonard Steinhorn decided to write this book, he's a professor of communications at American University. When he decided to write this book, he was inspired to defend his generation. He was born in 1957 because he said college students had no idea that the 60s generation did anything except drugs, according to his students. And I'd like to begin this talk with a similar anecdote. A couple of years ago, I team taught a course with one of my colleagues from sociology, and it was called The Meanings of Patriotism. And we decided to invite on campus Howard Zinn. Some of you might know him. He's a well-known, some might even say notorious, left-wing academic, scholar, anti-war activist. And Siena is conservative, so we wanted to give our students a taste of the other side. Okay, so we invited him on campus. And as luck would have it, he visited Siena just after we invaded Iraq. So we had over 1,000 people try to come on campus to see him. The campus was completely overwhelmed. And after the talk, we asked our students to write a reaction paper about Howard Zinn's talk, which they did. And they talked about Zinn, but what almost every student also talked about was the crowd that Zinn attracted. Oh my gosh, they were Birkenstock-wearing hippies with lots of license plates from Vermont. They were absolutely appalled and disgusted that these people were on campus. They were, held them in abhorrence. So we thought this was pretty funny. But Howard Zinn himself gained a lot of respect. The reason why he gained respect was because he gave a private talk to our students before his public address in which he revealed that he was a bombardier during World War II. And he became an anti-war activist because of his experience as a World War II veteran. That gave him, in the words of my students, street credentials. Okay? He was a veteran. And one reason is because, in my experience as a college teacher, the unforgivable sin of the baby boomers is the image of them disrespecting Vietnam veterans when they came home. So the fact that Howard Zinn was a veteran really gave him credence, so they were quite respectful towards him. But towards the people that he drew, forget it. They got no respect whatsoever. So Steinhorn students and my students seem to have a similar take on the 1960s. And then I was thinking, well, maybe it's just conservative East Coast students. So I did about 2 minutes of internet research yesterday and found a band from San Francisco, contemporary punk band. They're called Ashtray. Okay? And I found these lyrics that they wrote in their most recent song. It's not even released yet, and here are the lyrics. In San Francisco, of course, home of Haight-Ashbury. This is where the 60s live on. So this is what this band from San Francisco had to say. And I quote, these are lyrics. We're friends with the animals. We're friends with the trees. We are the flower children. We even love the bees. We follow fish around. That's a band. And we follow the dead. We're dirty, rotten hippies. We need a bullet in the head. Okay, so I think Steinhorn had a point in writing this book. By its title, of course, it's called The Greater Generation, and by its title, it's a direct rebuttal to Tom Brokaw's 1998 bestseller, The Greatest Generation, which was, of course, about the generation that lived through the Great Depression and then fought fascism in World War II. So, what does he have to say? This is Steinhorn. He argues that it is the boomers who created a permanent change in American values. That's his main argument. Thanks to the boomers, the official culture today rejects racism, sexism, and ageism. Here's a quote. Boomers should go down in history as a generation that fought a great cultural war to expand and advance liberty. conservative critics of the boomer generation, he compares to Luddites. These were the guys in industrializing England who went around and broke up the machinery because it was making them obsolete. And he says this is what's happening to conservatives, that they've become obsolete. So basically, their criticism is really a form of whining because they've lost their base of authority. In reply to the conservative critics who claim that boomers are without values, that they're lost in moral and cultural relativism, Steinhorn argues that on the contrary, boomers have their own book of values. William Bennett, Book of Values. Quote, long quote, boomers condemn bigotry, intolerance, and discrimination. They reject moralistic constraints on personal freedom and don't like it when women are patronized and not treated as equals. They find pollution as objectionable and see nothing moral in imposing religious beliefs on others. They believe a moral upbringing is teaching kids to think for themselves, not to follow arbitrary rules or blindly accept the status quo. And they have a hard time seeing the morality of ostracizing those whose sexual orientation and private behavior do no one any harm. What boomer culture embraces are the very American values of pluralism, privacy, freedom of choice, tolerance, and respect for others, no matter how different they are from you. To boomers, authority should be earned. Government should be open. Conscience should trump rules. The environment should be protected. People should feel free to express themselves. And we should have as much democracy as any organization or institution will allow. These are the boomer values, Steinhorn asserts, and they're as moral as the values of any previous generation. So, what makes them greater than Brokaw's greatest generation? He does give the parents of the baby boomers credit and tribute for bravery and fortitude, but then he castigates them for their intolerance. He says that they may have won the battle against fascism, but then when they came home, they tolerated a culture that was based on inequality and intolerance. At the height of the greatest generation's social, cultural, and political power, in other words, the late 1940s into the very early 1960s, Steinhorn finds that, and I'll give you several examples. The first one, in 1957, 10,000 blacks worked at the Ford auto plant in Dearborn, Michigan, yet, quote, not one Negro can live in Dearborn itself, unquote. And then another quote, if a black family somehow integrated and wanted to join one of the organizations at the center of white cultural life in the 1950s, the Rotary, Moose, Kiwanis, and Elks clubs, to name a few, they would be laughed at and obviously rejected, unquote. In professional basketball, there was an unwritten rule limiting the number of blacks who could play on the court at the same time. In a 1958 Gallup poll, 94% of whites said that they disapproved of mixed-race marriages. And in the late 1980s, it was the greatest generation that continued to, quote, express the feeling that a white would never want to marry a black, unquote. On the eve of World War I, a Roper poll for Fortune magazine found a majority of Americans supporting restrictions to keep Jews from, quote, mingling socially where they're not wanted, unquote. A 1954 poll found only 12% of Americans favored allowing an atheist to teach at a college or university, yet a 1955 poll, the very next year, of Americans found that over half couldn't name a single one of the four Gospels. And finally, a 1957 study by the University of Michigan found that 80% of adults, quote, said that a woman must be sick, neurotic, or immoral to remain unmarried, unquote. That was 1957. In truth, he concludes, the good old days weren't so good. Today, he asserts, quote, we live in a more humane America, a more equal America, a freer America, an America that no longer blesses the exclusion and abasement of people simply because of their background and gender. The real story of America in the baby boom, his main argument here, is how we've become a more open nation, a more accepting nation, a nation that's adopted a form of democratic pluralism and tolerance for people regardless of who they are and how they act, think, or look. And who do we have to thank for this change? Of course, it's the baby boomers. And the rest of the book elaborates on both themes, the injustices of the greater generation and the advances made by the baby boomers. Steinhorn asserts that most Americans actually hold baby boomer values, but they make up the new silent majority, which, sort of begs a question, is how do we explain a two-term conservative president? His answer is that even conservatives these days, thanks to the 1960s, have to at least give lip service to baby boomer values. Bush, for example, supports family leave, and that no one in any elected or appointed office can publicly voice racist or sexist views, although he admits that tolerance on grounds of homosexuality and reproductive freedom, such as abortion, are still not a done deal. And what he argues, and here I agree with him, is that few understand that America has experienced this sea change in ethos, and even fewer connected to the 1960s, which is his main argument. So who has hidden the achievements of the 1960s if they're so misunderstood? Clever conservatives. Conservatives have successfully trivialized boomers as hypocritical, navel-gazing adults who have never given up childish self-centeredness or the desire for instant gratification. Their stereotype is the former hippie, this is me talking, who has traded in his Birkenstocks for expensive driving moccasins, buys organic coffee for status rather than politics, has traded his joint for Merlot, and drives a gas-guzzling SUV with a Grateful Dead sticker on the bumper. Boomers have whined their way, this is also not just me, I'm reflecting what he's saying. Boomers have whined their way through every stage of life as if they were the first to experience adolescent rebellion, the first to work full-time, the first to experience parenting, and now the first to conquer old age. They are, quote, elitist, narcissistic, judgmental, self-righteous, and grandiose, unquote, according to conservative columnist George Will, quote, boomers believe that their existence and all its perfection is the great and final goal toward which the universe has been striving since the Big Bang, unquote. So, conservatives would have us believe that the only lasting contribution made by boomers to American culture is an unhealthy obsession with youth and casual Fridays. So, ouch. So in today's parlance, boomers have been served, okay? They need to defend themselves. So how does Steinhorn do this? How does he defend the 1960s and replace this generation to its rightful historical place? All right, so according to Steinhorn, we can thank baby boomers for the following. Number one, the ability to question authority, okay? To replace blind obedience with informed consent, the ability to expand the definition of patriotism from an unquestioning belief in our leaders to patriotic dissent based on our understanding of equality and democracy and freedom. And on a less serious note, he gives the 1960s generation credit for a certain thread of humor, irreverence, right, that is echoed in Saturday Night Live and the Jon Stewart Show today, both of which feed off of the culture of political and cultural satire created by the strident 1960s. Number two, the ability to challenge and expand gender roles. More specifically, he talks a lot about the participation of men in the home, doing childcare, doing housework, and with this, the rise of flex time at work. And I thought an interesting thing that he said was the increased presence of men at home in the daytime has led to the explosion of soccer teams and hockey teams and the soccer dad rather than just the soccer mom. All right, number three, the near elimination of the generation gap. According to Steinhorn, recent studies show an all-time high in the number of teenagers reporting good relations with their parents, especially as compared to the 1970s. He says that the baby boomers' obsession with youthfulness, he defends this as the right to remain playful and approachable in contrast to the stoic greatest generation that came before. Number four, boomer insistence on freedom of choice and the refusal to be blindly loyal to particular brands has given us this myriad of goods that now crowd our grocery shelves and department stores. We'll come back to that later. Number five, an acceptance of human sexuality rather than a denial of it, a definition of, versus the greatest generation and generations before that defined sex and body parts as somehow dirty. Number six, an increase in spirituality. Boomers rejected the rigidity of their parents' churches and traditional dogma, but they didn't leave spirituality behind. Instead, of course, they embraced forms that became known as New Age in terms of yoga and meditation, influences from Eastern religions, as well as going to traditional religions and picking and choosing within traditional religions. What came to mind, he doesn't say this, what came to mind is, you may have heard the term cafeteria Catholic, you pick and choose what you like, and those who combine different religions together in some kind of ecumenical mix that suits them. He also finds that our general conception of God has changed from the unforgiving autocratic God of the 1950s to a much kinder representation of God. He looks at this in the mass media. He brings up the film Bruce Almighty. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a Jim Carrey movie in which God was portrayed by a black actor. So religion has changed, although it hasn't gone away, it's changed. Number 7, hierarchies and organizational charts have largely disappeared in the workplace. Just like the autocratic God has changed, the organization man has gone away. The organization man is a phrase that was coined by William White in 1957, and it portrayed the way to get ahead in business is to fit in and slowly work your way up, but definitely to not rock the boat in any way. He said that's changed. Now corporations realize the need for initiative, to, the cliche is to think outside the box, and that the only way they can get people to think creatively is by allowing them more freedom in the workplace, by not holding them to an organizational chart or asking them to fit in, just the opposite. So, and he also mentions that corporations, whether or not it's actually true, have to at least give lip service to having a social conscience and maybe environmental concerns. You've probably seen the ads. Which brings us to number 8, environmentalism. Earth Day, first celebrated in 1970. Clearly, it's right at the height of the baby boom. He argues that questioning progress that comes in the form of DDT or strip mining as part of the 1960s generation. Brings us to number 9, investigative journalism, Watergate, Ralph Nader, the demand for sunshine laws to make government more transparent. Number 10, the opening up of higher education, not just the expansion of community colleges, but including individuals who were not included in college classes before, for example, including women and minorities and labor activists in a U.S. history course, in addition to presidents and generals. English courses are no longer about 10 dead white men and Emily Dickinson, but also might include Nora Zale Hurston and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And of course, new disciplines like Black studies and women's studies, whose very reason for being is to challenge the status quo and to ask new questions about the past. He's right about that, actually. Number 11. And finally, the blossoming of nonprofits. I thought this was interesting. In the 1950s and 60s, only about 5,000 nonprofit organizations were created each year. Since the 1970s, between 35,000 and 45,000 nonprofits are created each year. And of course, nonprofits, to go into the nonprofit sector is to take a salary cut compared to what you might get in a corporation. And of course, it includes the volunteer efforts of people who are working on the board, people who volunteer in these various institutions, and they could be anything from a historical institution to a watchdog group, consumer watchdog, political watchdogs. So those have blossomed, and he ties that to the experience of the 1960s and the questioning of authority. So, I'm a baby boomer. I read Abby Hoffman steal this book before I was old enough to drive, cover to cover. I knew how to make a Molotov cocktail, not that I ever would, but I knew. I read Mad Magazine. I agree with him. He makes this funny point, and a true point, I think, about Mad Magazine and being this culturally significant means by which people, raised or questioned authority. Well, it was full of it. I mean, it wasn't a good magazine, but it was really quite political. Jimi Hendrix had a person with fringe, so okay. So I was a baby boomer. But I'm also a trained historian, and I have serious trouble with this book. In an interview, Steinhorn actually said that he wrote this book with 2 hats. One was someone who experienced the 1960s firsthand, and the other one was as a historian. And he says that it was the historian side of him that, quote, allowed him to maintain a sense of perspective, unquote. And he said that he felt compelled to, quote, go beyond the media stereotypes and the cartoon images that we too often substitute for intellectual dialogue in this country, unquote. Well, I think he failed as far as that goes. This book in and of itself is not a history, it's not a dialogue, it's a monologue. It's a love letter to his own generation, and that's fine. That's fine, but it's not a history. It would have made a very nice, if overly long, op-ed piece, would make a very nice magazine article. As a history, it definitely falls short. Just the very premise of it, it's defensiveness. Why does he need to title it The Greater Generation? And what I think is really ironic is that he spends a great deal of time refuting the notion that the 1960s activists were really just acting out in adolescent rebellion against the father. What's he doing? He's sort of doing the same thing, isn't he? It's the same framework that he's working within. So we're not just as good as the so-called greatest generation, we're even better. Again, it's comparing apples and oranges. I think it's a silly premise, and it detracted from the really substantial message in his book. He also asserts that he's combating the cartoonish portrait of baby boomers, but he proceeds to create a cartoonish portrait of the greatest generation, of the parents of the baby boomers. Not every individual of this generation, that is, the parents of the baby boomers, agreed that discriminating against Jews, blacks, homosexuals, and women was acceptable. What about Rosa Parks? Where's Jackie Robinson? Or for that matter, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X? These leaders were not baby boomers. Right? Even the white politicians who passed through civil rights legislation in the 1960s were not baby boomers. What about John F. Kennedy? Not a baby boomer. Rachel Carson? Not a baby boomer. Nor is Ralph Nader, nor was Betty Friedan, nor was Gloria Steinem. What about Dr. Spock? Okay, he wrote the baby book in the 1950s and then proceeded to become very active in the anti-nuclear movement. Where is he? Where is my friend Howard Zinn? Not here. Okay? None of these people, not even Bob Dylan was a baby boomer. So, on the other hand, Jonathan Yardley observed in his review for the Washington Post, quote, "The generation that gave us Flower Power and Haight-Ashbury also gave us George W. Bush, born in 1946, Samuel Alito, born in 1940, John G. Roberts, Jr., 1955, and most members of the Bush cabinets." Steinhorn gives credit to the baby boomers for movements that were already in place before they were even in diapers. He has no historical sensibility and no apparent knowledge of previous generations, which then wreaks major damage on his causation. Does he really think that boomers created irreverence and satire? Has he never heard of H.L. Mencken or, for that matter, Jonathan Swift? Does he really think boomers were the first to question authority? Has he heard of David Thoreau or maybe, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson? Does he really think it was boomer demand for choice that gave us way too many cereals in the aisle at Price Chopper? I think there were other factors at play there. And it's true that the pill created a sexual revolution, but it was the second sexual revolution. In the 1910s and 1920s, premarital sex tripled, and you could thank Margaret Sanger and those big boxy cars for that one. And for that matter, who says that that was a good thing? Even feminists claim that the women of the 1960s felt exploited by the emphasis on sexual freedom, which quickly became sexual exploitation. The grounds upon which a woman could say no vanished with the advent of the pill and the advent of sexual permissiveness. Then Hollywood stepped in with a rating system that gave us G and PG and also XXX. Ultimately, today's raunch culture, characterized by Girls Gone Wild, the highly popular and lucrative DVD series in which apparently wholesome girls, that is, non-professionals, take off their tops and pretend to be porn stars for a few minutes of fame. And for that matter, where is the Weather Underground? Where is Stokely Carmichael? Where is the edgier 1960s? They're not here. As one critic claimed, this is the Ben & Jerry's version of the 1960s. And I have to say, it certainly goes down as easy as a dish of Cherry Garcia. Reviewers of the greater generation have been mixed. Jamie Malinowski equipped that, this is great, boomers can take credit for the 60s if they also accept blame for the 70s and 80s. Reviewers agree that mainstream America really has embraced a new ethic of equality and fairness that was lacking before the 1960s. But like me, they doubt that these new values can be so glibly attributed to a single generation. As Post-reviewer Jonathan Yardley observed, quote, "No generation is greater or greatest. It's just another bunch of people muddling through, trying to make the best of it, winning some and losing some." And with that, I end my remarks and open it up for discussion. Sure, go ahead, clap.
Wait.
I am not a boomer. Actually, I think my older children probably don't fall into it. My younger daughter, who's 39, definitely does. I had a lot of flashbacks when I read this. Things that I accepted that I never even questioned. When I started in nursing school in 1953, all medical schools in the country that I knew anything about, and they were Marians, had Jewish quotas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had a token black woman in our class. She had been recruited in the Indianapolis school system to come to Indiana University in the nursing school. I didn't think anything about it. Men came home from the Second World War every bit as damaged as they have come home from subsequent wars and stayed in their houses or their apartments. And if necessary, their families left for their own safety. Nothing was ever said in public. All these things, when I'm reading this book, I'm thinking, why didn't we ask any questions? The nursing profession that I went into, the authoritarian, autocratic profession that I went into, and many others, my children would no more tolerate than they would walk across the sea. Why didn't we object to standing up whenever a doctor walked on the floor? We never did. What was wrong with us? We were
I would answer there's nothing
nice
wrong.
little girls.
It was what was normative at the time, and it
Yes.
takes. The
But
thing
it was us, and it was our parents
Right.
before us, and it was our grandparents before them. It went back a long time,
Yeah.
that non-questioning attitude, that I
Well-
just can't understand.
Well, what I would argue is that there were all these precedents that I mentioned, all these names that did not belong to the baby. And you could go further back, go to W.B. Du Bois. I mean, there's a long list of activists. But I think what happened in the 1960s was the creation of a critical mass, a catalyst that made it all, that created, a big enough movement to really make permanent changes in the culture. I think Steinhorn goes wrong in attributing everything to this generation. However, they provided the numbers to make this change. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you have to look at in perspective is that changes, whatever, doesn't happen with an atom bomb. It doesn't just happen.
Right.
It happens over time. And you say, why didn't you question? You went to nursing school. Prior to your going to nursing school, there were not many nursing schools. Things don't happen, boom, like that. They
Right.
don't build, 5,000, they don't start 5,000 nursing schools. The point is, you got to go to nursing school. Your generation before that, the generation before that, didn't have them. So, when people they want what they want, and I want it now. They have no perspective on how things operate, how things develop. And to have things, I'm baby boom generation. And what really bothered me was the emphasis on what government can do. While you wanted your privacy, well, you didn't quite want your privacy for everybody else, because you used the arm of the government to get what you wanted now, rather than working. True, the government could turn around certain injustices, but to demand, and there was a demand on, this selfish, indulgent. I was a baby boomer, and I didn't feel anything for these people. I got locked at Columbia University because I was covering it for my college. I was covering the sit-ins, and I got locked there. I got locked in with these people who I detested. They were horrible. They trashed Columbia. They had no sense of private property. And it was, they wanted what they wanted right now. I want everything on demand. Instant gratification.
Mm-hmm.
And it was appalling. And, so everybody says, well, why didn't I question? Well, people, even your generation, they did question. Because they're the ones that began funding, not this generation, but your generation began funding universities. They're responsible for, Harvard's billion-dollar, what do you call it?
Endowment?
Thank you. See, generation is its mom, too.
Already, huh?
So, that's just an answer to say why.
Well, this is what he doesn't include. He does not
He doesn't.
include the excesses.
I read the book.
Yeah, he doesn't include the excesses.
No.
But he makes a good point. I mean, he does. Yes.
There was the drug scene that we don't mention about drugs that seem to generate in that generation.
Right.
I remember I was teaching in Albany High, and I had some students that were about to graduate, and they would be the boomers, and they would come in, and many of them were drunk in the classroom, fall asleep in the classroom, and I knew they were on drugs because they told me, and I have even met them later in life, now that they're adults, and they told me that there were so many things in their lives that they were escaping from into habits that were very, very bad. And this generation of boomers, when I talk to them now and they're in their 50s, I ask them if they vote, and they say no. No voting. And our voting pattern has gone down considerably. Who votes? The seniors vote. And I'm just amazed. I have sons that are boomer kids, and they have doctors. And when I talk to them about the problems in the world, they say it's too painful to get it. And did you vote? No. I'm talking about realistic facts now. I'm not fabricating. And I'm just amazed at their lack of interest. They don't give a damn. And if they're scientists, they're very involved in the cell and what's happening in their lab. They really are not concerned about many other things, and they come from the generation that we're talking about. So that I'm sitting here, and I think you've done a wonderful job because at the end you gave us the picture that balances, you know.
Oh, thank you.
That everything isn't just what we think it was. But I just feel that when I look back at history, I would say that the most wonderful generation that I could think of was the Founding Fathers. They gave us a document, 2 documents that we treasure. We can't believe that their wisdom was so deep and strong. And then I think of Abraham Lincoln preserving the Union and ridding the world on paper, at any rate, of slavery. And then I think of the period that I've been living in, a remarkable period with Franklin Roosevelt, with the Social Security Act, and all the things that made life so much better for us who are seniors at this age, and anticipated so much. And then I think of the terrible age that we're living in now, with violence, with horrors every day of our lives. And I think that the generation that will come, our grandchildren, if they survive, they will be the greatest generation to have lived and survived and carried on and maybe cherished this country as the great America that it is. So and I'm also amazed at this generation that doesn't know history, and you are a teacher of history. And I'm just, when I talk to the 50s and 60-year-olds, I have to give them a picture of what I've lived through. They don't know it, and they don't care to know it. And I'm probably throwing a lot of things that don't seem to connect, but I'm just talking out loud to myself.
No, that connected very well. It's kind of depressing, but it connected very well.
I'm just, now, as soon as I heard about this book, I said it had to be a baby boomer who wrote it.
Absolutely.
And I thought of a student that I had that made history in Albany. I won't give her the name. And she went to Brandeis, and she was one of these utopians that were going to change the world overnight. And they robbed a bank, and in the robbing they killed. And she had to spend at least 15 or 20 years of her young life, a very promising young woman. And many of them did this. It wasn't just one or two. They thought that they had the answer to so much and I think more damage can be done by young people who really haven't got the wisdom
Right.
and experience of life. and they think everything can go just the way their little logical minds transfer.
Youth is wasted on the
And
young.
it's so hard. You're delighted to hear a young person talk about what he wants the world to be like. But you're so frustrated when you know that it takes time and wisdom, and you'll never know the answers to so many things going on, the hatred, the violence. I think the only hope that I have for the future is that we're going to spend a lot of money studying the brain. I understand that neurosurgery is going to be the thing of tomorrow. And maybe we'll learn something about this crazy, insane, wonderful, mysterious object that we call the thinking, the brain, and learn why there's so much violence, so much hatred, and in all classes of people, not just the uneducated, but the educated, who during the Holocaust were experimenting and killing and supporting a monster like a Hitler.
Right.
And so
Can't hear you.
life is
She
really
can't.
exciting, and I'm glad he wrote the book. I'm glad I listened to you,
Oh, thank you.
and I'm glad that you, as a baby boomer, I'm thinking of the communes too, and the sects that grew up during this period, where there were dropouts that went
Right.
to make another world for themselves.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Are people in other countries that were born in the baby boom generation, are they considered baby boomers also? Say, for instance, in, Second World War, we fought against Germany and Poland and in the Netherlands. Are all those people considered baby boomers that were born in the same generations as we were, or not?
I'm an Americanist, so I can't answer in terms of demography in other countries.
But I mean, how they affect their parts of the world as well, just the United States.
No, it was international. In 1968, there were protests in Paris and Budapest and all over Europe in 1968, some of which were actually anti-war protests. So there were protests also by the same group of people in terms of age demographics in the late 1960s in the industrialized part of the world.
But do you think that they have influenced their countries' generations as we have here in America?
I really
As
can't
far as
answer that.
This person that
I can't really answer that. I think that a lot of what happened in the United States is due to our atypical affluence in this country. That we have, a lot of this generation was shaped by the fact that they had so much. That's not going to be true of post-war Europe. They really didn't have as much, and they had a very extensive social welfare structure that we didn't have. So they had different experiences. But I do know that all these countries erupted in protests at about the same time with about the same age group in the late 1960s.
I'm thinking about how a lot of European countries, and not just European countries, but countries all over the world a lot of them are emphasizing environmental issues. And is it because of the fact that the people that live there are, around our same age, are thinking about...
Well, they were enlightened by the same kind of literature, the Rachel Carson, Simon Spring. That in itself was read internationally. And really, it's confined to industrialized countries that were using the same kinds of chemicals. And you're going to find a different situation on the other side of the Iron Curtain, where they didn't clean up until the end of communism. So it really depends on where you are. But in wealthy industrialized countries, in other words, Northern Europe, Western Europe, and the United States,
It seems to me
Canada.
that they're ahead of us. In fact, a lot of these countries, as far as preserving the environment.
They often are. It has to do with the fact, I think, that they have stronger leftist political parties, Labour Party, for example, Green Party in Europe, than we really have in this country. We have a pretty narrow political range in terms of mainstream elections. So, any other comments?
Who knows? All right, well.
Oh, thank you very
Thanks
much.
for coming. Thanks for coming, Karen.
Oh, thank you.